Welcome everybody at this final policy conference of the Upstream Project on the mainstreaming of integration governance. My name is Peter Scholten. I'm from Erasmus University, Rotterdam, and I'm the coordinator of the Upstream Project. And well, today is actually the final policy conference of our project. It has been quite a long journey in this project on integration mainstreaming. The first step, a big step, and we'll reflect about that a little bit more today, it was to find out what it means, mainstreaming. It was typical one of those buzzwords that suddenly emerged in EU discourse, but also I'm from the Netherlands and Dutch discourse. And everybody thought, well, it rings a bell, it seems relevant, but what does it mean? What does mainstreaming actually mean? Well, that is something that our project spent months trying to find out, and we've also written extensively about that already. I hope everybody managed to obtain a copy. But there are a couple of policy briefs in the background, and one of them is also about defining, conceptualizing what mainstreaming actually means. And there is, I'm proud to say, perhaps somebody can wave it, our final policy report of the project. And this is the first time that it is really available to the public. So you're also the first ones to receive a copy. Everything will be available online on our website as well, so if you want to suggest anything that you hear or read here today to your colleagues, please pinpoint them to our website. So, what we want to do today with this final policy conference is to discuss with you some of our main findings from the Upstream project, and also to see where the findings can bring us in terms of policy lessons. Can we make integration policies better? Can mainstreaming indeed be a mechanism to face integration challenges in a better way than we have done before? And if so, under what conditions can mainstreaming be effective and successful? We did find out, and in a moment we're going to hear more about that not in all situations, not under all conditions, mainstreaming works very well. Under some conditions, mainstreaming can, in fact, have inadvertent effects. And we'll also talk about and discuss with you, I hope, as also a lot of policymakers and practitioners here today, about how to mainstream in practice. It's an interesting idea, and we have found some cases where it can help, but then still it's quite an abstract term, abstract idea, and in integration research we have had quite our share of abstract notions that come and go once in every decade or so. But how can we, if you want to mainstream, how can you do that? How can you make mainstreaming work on the actual level of integration policy implementation? About the Upstream project, we are a European Integration Fund project at the final stages after 1.5 years of doing research. That's not just Rotterdam, of course. We're a project with 6 partners. Our first partner is Migration Policy Institute Europe, to whom we are very grateful that they were willing to host our conference here today in this beautiful venue, in this beautiful city also. And the other partners involved in the project are the INET Institute from Paris with Mélodie Beaujeu, who's sitting there, and Professor Patrick Simon, who's sitting in the audience. University of Complutense Madrid with Elisa Bray, who's sitting in the panel. And Professor Joaquin Arango, who is could not be here today. The Center of Migration Research, today represented by Ignacy Jozwiak, they're also in the panel. And by the Compass Institute of the University of Oxford, who will be represented here, I hope in a couple of minutes, by Ole Jensen, whose train Eurostar was apparently delayed. So he'll be here in a couple of minutes, and he'll work together with Ben Gidley, also from the Compass Institute. And for Erasmus University, I didn't do all the work on my own, but actually most of the work was done by Ilona van Breugel, who's sitting there in the audience as well. So if you have difficult questions about the project, you can always relay them to Ilona van Breugel. She knows everything about Upstream. So after this brief introduction, today's final conference consists of 3 parts. And in the first part, we will begin with an opening address by Elizabeth Collett, one of the main authors of our final report that has been handed out today. So she will get the first word after this introduction. Then we'll have a panel discussion that is immediately following Elizabeth's keynote address. And this panel debate with the researchers from the Upstream Project will focus on some of what we think the most intriguing findings are from our project. And we'll try to deepen them out a little bit and also invite you to jump in. If it doesn't make sense, please speak up. And if you want to know more, if it rings a bell from your practice, then also please speak up. We want to make this an interactive session today, so not just a listening session. Then the second part of today will focus on the urban level. It's a panel debate with a couple of guests who have been invited and will say something about their experiences with mainstreaming at the urban level in particular. And that's also one the findings of our project, that mainstreaming seems to apply primarily to the urban level of integration policy making, of integration governance. And then the final session will be an armchair session where we will talk about the broader implications of the idea of mainstreaming for, in particular, policy coordination. So if you want to embrace the idea of mainstreaming, how can you make sure that it actually works? What is required from you as a policy organization in terms of coordination to make sure that it works and to prevent situations where it does not work? Okay, this is basically the introduction of today's session. I would like to invite Liz to come to the speaker's corner for the presentation on our key findings.
Thank you, Peter. And I think I should be honest about the fact that keynote address is rather overstating it. And I'm also replacing someone who was supposed to be speaking, which is Ben Gidley from Compass at Oxford, who unfortunately couldn't come today. So if you can imagine me as, I think we just went for the same accent rather than anything else. But other than that, Ben is very different from me. So apologies for any missteps with this presentation. How do I nod? So as Peter's outlined, the goal of the Upstream Project was to explore how government at all levels faces the challenge or even explores how to do mainstreaming of migrant integration in 5 different countries. And the idea of mainstreaming is really that the whole of government approach to immigrant inclusion rather than thinking this as a siloed policy area in one particular part of government. The goal of the Upstream Project was to work with policymakers, frontline officials, civil society and migrant organisations through focus groups, roundtables and research at the local, national and EU level to really try and understand how this has been working, and also allowed the opportunity of transnational knowledge exchange, so bringing policymakers from one country to another to really see and understand how other policymakers have been dealing with what turn out to be very similar challenges at local level, but they may be working in different governments contexts or with different resources and with different migrant communities. So how might they learn from each other? Our research teams, as Peter outlined, 5, our coordinating team, Erasmus University, and I do point again to Ilona, who is the brain behind this project, who you should definitely try and catch up with over lunch. Our UK, they coordinated the project and they did the Dutch research, UK, Poland, France, Spain, and then at the European level, we covered that part of the research. I can name them all again, but you did it so beautifully, I don't want to being accused of repetition. So we first looked at the politics of mainstreaming, the concept. What does it mean to officials? What have been the drivers behind using mainstreaming, where it has been used, or the decision not to mainstream, where it hasn't been used? And we focused in on two main policy areas, education and social cohesion. The first phase of research was to work with, to interview policymakers at all levels to understand that decision-making process. The second phase of research was then in-depth analysis at city level in 2 neighbourhoods per city and 2 cities per country. So 10 neighbourhoods overall. Or have I got that wrong? My maths is terrible today.
Yes, 10.
Yes.
Not for the EU.
And excluding the European Union, which turned out to be a very special case. And to explore the effects of mainstreaming with practitioners. The focus was on particular subfields of policy that would help us really understand where mainstreaming could be applied and in different ways it could be applied. We chose two types of policy in each of the broader policy areas, education and social cohesion. First, we took generic policy areas where policy is designed for the whole of community, but we were looking at how well those policies were also adapted to the needs of those with immigrant background. And then specific policy areas where the policy was designed to meet a particular need that was evident within the immigrant community. As you can see here, those are the 4 policy areas. So, for example, in the generic area and education, we looked at early years. All children have early years policies, but it's particularly important for children with immigrant background to be incorporated into early education programming. So how well is that done in the countries under review? And with social cohesion, understanding neighbourhood initiatives. That sounds like a very broad idea, but inter-community contact, local level initiatives amongst communities, and trying to understand better how community interaction takes place. And then in the specific subfield, in the education, we looked at new arrivals, the specific language needs and other needs, introductory needs of new arrivals into education system of immigrant children. And then in the social cohesion frame, looking at anti-discrimination and equality issues, which are much more directed towards the immigrant population. And for each of these, there were case studies. And for each country in the neighbourhoods, they looked at newly diverse areas and then areas that have had long-standing diversity. With early years, looking at least 1 nursery school per neighbourhood. For equality and anti-discrimination, trying to contrast the perspective of the local authority versus the perspective of migrant and minority groups. And with new arrivals, really thinking through the school system at primary level and at secondary level in each neighbourhood. And then in each country, I can take you through the neighbourhoods that were involved. I thought I nodded. In France, in Lyon, you have 1 gentrified former working class area and 1 diverse and deprived area, Mermoz, in Lyon. And then Saint-Denis, which is a suburb of Paris, taking 2 neighbourhoods, Gare Centreville, which is a gentrified area with a large migrant and minority population, and Hollande, a working class area of social housing and deprivation. In the Netherlands, it's all to play for. These are the 2 neighbourhoods that in Amsterdam, Oost and Zuidoost. My Dutch is really bad, by the way.
It sounds pretty good.
Lisselmond and Delfshaven in Rotterdam. And Peter can explain more about the composition of those communities when we get into the panel discussion. In Poland, this is going to go really badly. In Warsaw, as you can see, several neighbourhoods with different percentages of foreigners, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce that, I'm going to leave that to Nasi. And in Poznan, where, as we can see with the Polish case, the percentage of foreigners in the country is much lower than with the other countries that we looked at. So it's really a contrasting case to many of the other case studies under review. And then in the UK, a suburb of London, Southwark, looking at Grange, which is a sort of new gentrified area with new diversity, and Peckham, which is super diverse and fairly deprived. And Bristol, looking at Lawrence Hill, which is a very central location in Bristol, deprived and diverse, and Lockleys, which is further out from the city, deprived and newly diverse. So the key findings. One of the key findings was there was no single understanding of what mainstreaming is amongst policymakers or any of the interviewees. There were many different ways in which you could draw out a meaning. Quite often not using the term mainstreaming helps with that. Understanding mainstreaming as a shift from targeted policies towards immigrant groups to really using more generic policies. Understanding mainstreaming as a new type of narrative used by governments at national and local level to emphasize the inclusion of the whole of society. Government cooperation and coordination on immigration. How well does the government, those responsible specifically for integration, work with those responsible for broader public service provision? And finally, opening up public services to diverse populations and ensuring that services don't have an adverse impact or exclude particular groups when they are reformed. Some of the key challenges for integration are challenges, I think, in many policy areas at the moment. In many established immigration countries are facing quite serious funding cuts, which then creates an additional challenge of how to formulate and implement mainstream policies while still maintaining an inclusive approach to them, and that all agencies then take on an anti-discrimination agenda when they are under pressure to deliver so much with fewer resources. Mainstreaming was also suggested that mainstreaming could be an excuse for retrenchment or inaction in a number of countries. When governments do find their budgets cut, mainstreaming is then a justification for abolishing programs that might serve an important social purpose for immigrant groups but may not necessarily be popular with publics who see immigrants being prioritised over other communities, or may just not be seen as central or essential policies. It's also, there's also the risk that a mainstreamed approach may reduce the level of specialisation in policies and the number of specialists who understand integration policies, but also advocates for those populations. In newer migration countries, the challenge is slightly different because integration funding is heavily dependent on EU funding. And in our third panel today, we'll go more into sort of the role of the EU in terms of supporting mainstreamed and other integration processes, or through the NGO community. So the work is by definition far more targeted and much less mainstream. Other challenges include the risk of excluding certain groups through a mainstreamed approach, and also vague definitions. If you're not identifying your goal through a mainstreamed policy and adapting public services, you may not actually be able to then articulate the right way of designing those policies. So in terms of success stories, our research has found that mainstreaming by accident seems to occur quite a lot, where there's no conceptual predefinition of what should take place, but a very pragmatic, on-the-ground reaction to the needs of the community and responding as such, and seeing diversity as a mainstream issue for government rather than a niche issue. At street level, at very local level, officials are increasingly at ease with diversity in all the countries studied. And in neighbourhoods with a longer experience, the expertise is actually embedded in practice across. So they may not call it straight mainstreaming, they may not think of it as mainstreaming, but we see increasingly the needs of the community are driving a more mainstreamed approach at local level. In terms of obstacles, integration is seen as a luxury policy in some regards. It's seen as something that could be taken away quite easily, despite the deep politicisation of immigration narratives in most of the countries under the study. And there's a risk of diluting an anti-discrimination agenda at the same time. This is particularly the case in the UK, the Netherlands, and France. And cuts to special programmes mean that agencies don't necessarily have the flexibility when they need to deal with the specific needs. And this is one, I think, broader conclusion of our project is mainstreaming holds some potential, but it holds also huge risks if it becomes the dominant or singular way of thinking about integration, that targeted and specific policies are also very much needed in this context. And one of the risks of mainstreaming is that those are then taken away because a mainstreamed approach means everything should be mainstreamed. And this is particularly when we talk about Poland and a newer country of immigration, there's a problem of scale. If the immigrant population is small and diversity is still a nascent concept, it's hard to think about mainstreaming because then you may be diverting resources disproportionately to a much smaller population and you may need more targeted services. But in all countries, and it's something across the board for all countries, the absence of reliable data and sufficient data to really understand when mainstream policies are actually reaching all parts of the population, whether they have immigrant background or not, and to really understand the efficacy of mainstream processes is a real problem. There's a definite need for more data and more detailed data at the local level to help policymakers understand when they may need to modify and assess and redesign certain policy interventions. And the final point on the findings is that one of the risks of mainstreaming is that there are particularly vulnerable immigrant groups who may not be addressed, and this again goes back to the targeting issue, may not be addressed through mainstreaming policies. New migrants, particularly from new origin countries, and those with less immigration history, may not be included in traditionally focused policies. Those with limited or unclear status, those sort of grey legal status, and hidden migrant populations, particularly older migrants, may not be covered by mainstream policies. So you have to be very cognizant not just of the diversity within your population, but the very, very specific and diverse needs within the immigrant community itself. It's not sufficient to think of an immigrant community as homogenous, but who are the different populations within that, and how can you make sure your services reach all of them? I'm just going to touch on some selected conclusions in the reports that we've set out. There are a large number of conclusions, some of which are directed at different governance levels, some of which are generic. But two useful concepts that my colleagues Helen and Megan actually developed, which I think are quite helpful for thinking about mainstreaming, is mobility proofing and diversity proofing, and the distinction between the two. Mobility proofing is the idea that you're adapting services to cope with the increasingly diverse needs of immigrants and the